The first time Coda laid eyes on the cabin, it stood like a stubborn scar against the mountainside, weathered and defiant in the thinning light of dusk. The ridge itself seemed to lean forward, as if daring the world below to try and climb it. Pine trees crowded thick around its edges, their needles whispering secrets to the wind. A curl of thin smoke rose from the crooked chimney, too steady to be a ghost, too fragile to belong to anything but human hands. Coda's horse, a black mare with ribs faintly showing beneath her winter coat, snorted and pawed the earth uneasily. She knew, as he did, that the cabin should not have been alive. The boards sagged, roof half collapsed, shutters hanging loose as though a storm had tried to rip them off years ago and failed. By all rights, the place should have been abandoned, but life stirred inside Dot, and this was supposed to be his. He had ridden 3 days from the reservation, through country where every shadow looked like a rifle barrel, every stranger's stare cut like a blade. The dollars in his pocket had not come easy earned by breaking horses that were not his, hauling timber for men who spat when they paid him, and selling pieces of his warrior's pride one day at a time. When he handed that crumpled money over to a broker in town, the man laughed. "Bought yourself a grave on the mountain, Apache. That's all that cabin is." But Coda had not cared. A grave was better than chains. A mountain grave was better than watching the last of his people wither in the dust of forgotten promises. He thought perhaps, just perhaps, he could find silence there. Yet silence was not what met him when he reined in at the clearing. The air was sharp, cold enough to bite his lungs, but it carried something else, something watching. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled. He swung off his horse, boots crunching against frosted needles. His hand brushed instinctively against the knife strapped at his side, though he made no move to draw it. He was tired of fighting ghosts. But still, some part of him expected one. Then a voice, clear and steady, cut through the stillness. "You came." Coda froze. The words were not an accusation, not a question, but a statement weighted with certainty. Slowly, his eyes rose to the porch. There she stood, a girl, no, a young woman, her figure framed by the crooked beams of the cabin's doorway. Her hair was pale, the color of wheat caught in late summer sun, braided neatly down her shoulder. In her hands, resting casual but not careless against the doorframe, was a rifle. Her stance was straight, steady, as though she had been waiting, not just minutes, but years, for him to arrive. Coda's chest tightened. He did not know her, yet she looked at him as though she had known his face all her life. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke, pine, and something cooking within rabbit, maybe, or deer. A life lived here, in this ruin he thought he had. Purchased alone. "You came," she repeated, softer this time. Though her knuckles whitened against the wood of the rifle, Coda said nothing at first. He studied her with the same quiet intensity he had once given to enemy scouts, to the tracks of deer and snow, to storms building far out on the horizon. Her eyes, gray as winter clouds, did not waver. Finally, his voice came low, gravelly. "From days of dust and silence. This is my cabin." The faintest flicker crossed her face, something between a smile and sorrow. "No," she whispered, almost tender. "It's ours." Her words struck him like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread inside him, confusion, unease, something else he did not yet have the courage to name. He had come here to escape, to bury himself in the mountain silence. But now it seemed the mountain had been waiting too, and it had chosen not to leave him alone. The fire in the cabin crackled. The mare shifted restlessly. The girl on the porch did not move. Coda's hand, still resting on his knife, curled into a fist. Who was this mountain's daughter? And why, in the heart of his exile, did she speak as though she had been waiting for him? Her name came softly, as though the pines themselves whispered it. Eliza. She spoke it without ceremony, like someone used to being forgotten, and for a moment it hung in the still air between them. Eliza. She did not lower the rifle, though she kept it at an angle, not quite threatening, not quite welcoming. Her dress was faded calico, patched at the elbows and frayed at the hem, a frontier woman's gown worn thin by long winters and lonely work. Yet there was a stubborn strength in her stance, her boots planted firmly on the warped boards of the porch as if she had been born from the wood itself. Coda, still silent, studied her with the patience of a hunter. His people had taught him that names held power, but this woman's power was not in her name, it was in her gaze. Her gray eyes carried storms, the kind that built slow and sudden over the mountains, ready to break. "You shouldn't be here," she said at last. Her voice was low, almost steady, though it trembled at the edges like a bowstring pulled too tight. "The mountain doesn't take kindly to strangers." Coda let his hand fall away from his knife. He lifted his chin toward the cabin. "I bought this place." Eliza's lips curved, not in humor, but in something between sorrow and disbelief. "Men in town will sell anything. Doesn't mean it belongs to them, or to you." The fire popping inside the cabin filled the silence that followed. Coda felt the weight of his journey pressing down on him, the hunger, the cold, the endless miles. He had thought this cabin would be nothing but wood and stone, empty but for the ghosts of men long gone. Yet here was this girl, young but carrying an old grief in her shoulders, speaking as if she had been waiting for him. He took a cautious step closer. The Mari snorted and pawed the ground, but the woman didn't flinch. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Eliza's eyes flicked past him, to the slope of the ridge where the pines grew thick and dark, then back again. She hesitated before answering, and when she did, her words struck like a knife hidden beneath. "Cloth. Because someone had to stay." The firelight behind her glowed warmer now, spilling against the shadows of her hair. She drew a breath and spoke with a quiet urgency. "My father built this cabin. He trapped these woods until the mountain claimed him 2 winters ago. Everyone told me to leave to sell, to run down to the valley and marry some man with land and cattle, but my father made me promise. This place holds more than wood and stone. It holds debts, secrets, a fire that cannot go out." Her fingers brushed against the rifle, not with fear, but reverence, as though it too was part of her inheritance. Coda listened, the words settling into him like snow into deep tracks. She spoke not just of survival, but of duty, of chains invisible, yet stronger than iron. He knew that weight. He had carried it in every battle, in every grave he left behind. But there was something else, something strange in the way she looked at him. She did not speak as though she had just met him. She spoke as though she had expected him. "You've been waiting," he said slowly, suspicion mingling with curiosity. "For me?" Eliza's gaze did not waver. The rifle dipped slightly, her grip easing. "Not for you, for the one who would come. My father told me, someday someone would stand here, and I'd know." The words hung heavy, almost dangerous. The wind rattled the shutters, pine needles hissing like whispers. Coda's breath tightened in his chest. He had come seeking silence, only to find himself thrust into another story. Still, the mountain had not turned him away. The cabin had not collapsed under him. And this woman, the mountain's daughter, looked at him with a certainty that unsettled him more than any rifle ever could. She lifted her chin, her voice soft but unshaken. "The mountain keeps its promises, even the ones we do not understand." Coda stood there, the cold biting his skin, the world narrowing to the distance between them. For the first time in years, he wondered if his journey had not been his choice at all. That night, the wind turned restless. It howled down the ridge, clawing at the cabin walls as though testing their strength. rattling loose shingles, slipping cold fingers through the cracks. Inside, the fire fought bravely, its glow painting the rough-hewn beams with flickering light. Shadows stretched long across the floorboards, twisting into strange shapes that made the place feel less like shelter and more like a waiting mouth. Kota sat near the hearth, silent, his broad shoulders bent forward, long black hair falling in loose strands over his chest. The muscles in his arms tensed with the memory of years gone, when nights like this were filled with war councils and the cries of warriors readying for battle. But here, it was only the crackle of flame and the steady breathing of the woman who sat across from him. Eliza. Her pale braid gleamed in the firelight, her gray eyes fixed not on him but on the dark beyond the window. She didn't look afraid, at least not of the night. Instead, there was a kind of mournful familiarity in her gaze, as though she listened to something unseen. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, steady, almost reverent. The mountain is never quiet. People think it's the wind they hear, or the wolves, but those who live here long enough know better. Kota's brow furrowed. What do they hear? Eliza's eyes shifted back to him, her fingers brushing along the wooden stock of her rifle. Debts, secrets, the kind of promises men make and then forget until the mountain remembers for them. The fire popped, a spark leaping toward the ceiling. For a moment, Kota thought of the graves back on the reservation, the countless promises broken by treaties that rotted faster than the ink dried. Promises his people had paid for with blood. The mountain's whispers, Eliza said. He knew those whispers already. Her voice softened. My father used to say a man can't run from the mountain's truth. It'll find him sooner or later, whether in a dream or in the bite of winter or in the hands of someone like me. Kota's eyes narrowed, studying her carefully. She sat steady, not flinching from his gaze. It unsettled him, the way she seemed to know pieces of him he had not offered. Why do you stay here? He asked. Eliza's lips pressed together for a moment, and then she drew in a long breath as if summoning courage. Because of the fire. Kota glanced at the hearth, confused. She leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of an oath. My father said the fire in this cabin must never die. Not just for warmth, not just for survival, but because it carries the memory of every promise tied to this land. If it goes out, the mountain will fall silent, and silence is worse than death. Silence means the land is lost forever. Kota's jaw tightened. The weight of her words felt too heavy for so small a space. He had come to this cabin for solitude, for escape. Yet here was a woman telling him he was sitting in the heart of something sacred. You think I'm meant for this? He asked at last, his voice low, almost bitter. Eliza's eyes did not falter. I don't think. I know. The cabin creaked under the push of wind. Outside, wolves howled, their cries rising and falling like a prayer. The fire threw shadows over Eliza's face, making her look older, timeless, as though she were both the girl on the porch and some spirit of the mountain itself. Kota felt his warrior's heart stir, uneasy. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss her. Words as foolishness, the kind of tale he's told to comfort lonely souls in the wilderness. And yet he could not. Something in the air pressed against him, something ancient that went beyond wood and stone. Eliza leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried like wind through the pines. The mountain brought you here for a reason, Kota. You may not see it now, but you will. When the time comes, you'll know what the promise demands. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt the full measure of what she believed. It was not madness. It was conviction, stronger than steel, deeper than blood. The fire hissed. The wind screamed against the shutters, and Kota realized this mountain would not give him silence. It would give him a burden, and perhaps, just perhaps, a destiny. Morning came gray and brittle, the kind of light that made every tree look like a sentinel standing guard. Coda woke to the sound of hooves, faint but deliberate, drifting up the ridge from the valley below. He had heard it in his dreams first, men's voices rising in cruel laughter, then the clink of spurs and the metallic promise of rifles. When he opened his eyes, the sound was still there. Eliza stood at the window, her pale braid catching the dawn. She didn't turn when she spoke. "They've found the trail." Coda pushed himself up, his muscles stiff from sleep, the embers of the fire glowing faintly behind him. He could already sense the truth in her words. Men were coming, men who believed land was theirs by the simple act of wanting it. He rose and moved beside her, peering through the warped frame of the window. Down the slope, winding up the narrow trail cut between pines, came 6 riders. Their hats were low against the morning chill, rifles strapped across their backs, their coats long and dust-stained. Even from this distance, Coda recognized the swagger, the kind of men who lived by greed and firepower. "They don't belong here," he muttered. Eliza's voice was bitter. "They think otherwise." She turned to him then, her gray eyes hard, her jaw set with a quiet fury. "The cabin sits on silver. Not much, not enough for a mine, but enough to make them dream. My father knew it. That's why he never dug it out. He said silver in the mountain was cursed, that it would devour the men who touched it. But curses don't scare them. Only profit drives them." Coda's lips pressed into a grim line. He understood greed. He had seen it take land, take lives, take entire nations apart piece by piece. These men weren't coming to ask. They were coming to take. Eliza stepped closer, her voice trembling though her gaze did not. "I can't stop them alone." Her words were not plea but truth, laid bare between them like an open wound. Coda felt her fear, her anger, and beneath it all, her faith in something greater. She looked at him not as a stranger, but as the one. The mountain had chosen to stand beside her. For a long moment, Coda said nothing. He had not come to fight another's war. His spirit was weary, his body scarred by battles that had already stolen too much from him. Yet the fire in Eliza's eyes stirred something he thought long buried, the warrior's heart that refused to kneel. His hand tightened on the knife at his belt. "They will not take it," he said, voice low but sharp as steel. Outside, the riders drew nearer, their laughter echoing against the trees. One fired a shot into the air, the report cracking like thunder. Birds burst from the branches, wheeling into the gray sky. Eliza's fingers brushed against his arm. He glanced at her, and for the first time he saw no fear in her face, only resolve. "My father told me the mountain would test me, that when the time came, I'd have to stand or be swallowed whole. I think," she hesitated, her eyes steady on his, "I think it brought you here to stand with me." Coda's chest tightened. The weight of her belief pressed against him, heavy but strangely welcome. Perhaps he had not stumbled into this place by chance. Perhaps the mountain had called him, as it had her. The hooves thundered closer now, the riders breaking into view at the edge of the clearing, their faces hard and hungry. Dust clung to their coats, pistols glinting in the pale light. One man, broad-shouldered with a scar carved down his cheek, pointed toward the cabin and barked a laugh. "Looks like the girls got company," he sneered. Coda stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting his skin. He stood tall, shirtless, his long black hair whipping in the wind, tribal jewelry catching the weak morning light. His gaze locked on the riders, unwavering. Eliza moved to stand beside him. Rifle in hand, her shoulders squared. The leader smirked at the sight, but his eyes narrowed with unease. This was not the picture of a frightened girl hiding in the woods. This was defiance, carved into flesh and fire. Coda's voice carried across the clearing, deep and steady. "This land is not yours. The riders reined in, their laughter faltering. The mountain itself seemed to hold its breath. For the first time in years, Koda felt the fire of battle stir fully within him. The silence he had come seeking was gone. In its place stood purpose, sharp as the blade at his side. The mountain had spoken, and Koda would answer. The first shot shattered the morning dot. It punched through the cabin's window with a scream of splintering glass, spraying shards across the room like angry sparks. Eliza ducked instinctively, the rifle clutched tight to her chest. Koda's body moved without thought. He pulled her down behind the heavy table, the muscles in his arm taut as steel. His warrior's blood, long forced into silence, surged back with a roar that filled his chest. Outside, the riders whooped and hollered, circling their horses just beyond the clearing, their pistols flashing in the gray light. The smell of gunpowder stung the air, sharp and acrid. "They mean to burn us out," Eliza hissed, her gray eyes fierce but steady. Koda crawled toward the window, shards crunching under his palm, and peered through the jagged frame. One rider had already swung a burning torch, hurling it at the cabin's roof. Flames licked the wood, eager to spread. Koda's hand shot to his bow, which leaned in the corner, a relic of the life he had promised himself he had left behind. He strung an arrow with the precision of instinct, his movement smooth as breath. The shaft hissed through the morning air and struck true. The torch-bearer toppled from his saddle with a cry, the torch falling harmlessly into the frost. The other riders cursed, scattering wide, their bravado faltering. They had not expected resistance, not from a lone girl, and certainly not from the tall, bare-chested warrior now stepping into the doorway with his bow in hand, his long black hair whipping wild in the wind. Tribal beads and feathers gleamed against his chest like war paint. "Koda!" Eliza shouted, tossing the rifle toward him. He caught it clean, cradled it like an extension of himself, and fired. One shot cracked across the clearing, and a rider's hat flew from his head. The man swore and jerked his reins hard, retreating behind the others. The mountain echoed with chaos. Horses screamed, bullets tore through bark, and smoke drifted in thin, angry ribbons. Through it all, Eliza moved like she had trained for this moment all her life. She crouched beside the hearth, loading bullets into the rifle with nimble, steady hands, her face set with a determination that belonged not to a farmer's daughter, but to a woman of iron. When Koda fired, she was already ready with the next round. When he shouted for cover, she moved without hesitation. Another bullet slammed into the doorframe, wood exploding into splinters inches from Koda's shoulder. He ducked low, returned fire, and dropped another rider from his saddle. The man's body hit the earth hard, a scream cut short by silence. Eliza's breath came fast, but her eyes burned. "You fight like the mountain itself," she said between gasps, sliding another cartridge into place. Koda did not answer. His mind had fallen into the rhythm of survival, the same rhythm that had carried him through ambushes and battles long ago. He was no longer the weary wanderer who had sought a cabin in the snow. He was warrior once more. Minutes felt like hours. The fight raging until the ground outside was torn with hoof prints and stained with blood. 3 men lay still, their bodies sprawled in unnatural silence. The remaining riders shouted curses and pulled hard on their reins, retreating into the cover of the trees, their gunfire dwindling. The clearing fell quiet again, but it was not the peace Koda had sought. The cabin smelled of smoke and lead. The windows shattered, the walls scarred with bullet holes. The fire in the hearth hissed, as though angry at what it had witnessed. Eliza leaned against the wall, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. Yet her eyes met Koda's with something fiercer than fear, something close to pride. "They'll be back," she said. "Men like that don't stop until they've taken what they came for." Koda nodded, his chest rising and falling with the weight of truth. Then we'll be ready." But inside, his thoughts churned. This was no longer about a cabin, or even the silver veins hidden in the earth. The mountain had revealed its teeth. And Eliza, the daughter who had kept the fire alive, had bound him to its promise whether he wanted it or not. He looked out into the trees, the morning light breaking through in fractured beams. Somewhere beyond those shadows, more men would come, and when they did, the mountain would demand more than blood. It would demand sacrifice. The snow outside had turned pink with the first blush of dawn, but inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the copper tang of gunpowder and the sharp scent of splintered pine. Koda's broad shoulders rose and fell as he stood watch by the doorway. His long black hair damp with sweat, his chest marked with the faint dust of smoke. He looked like a figure carved from the mountain itself, unyielding, ancient, and alive with a fire no bullet could quench. Elena knelt by the hearth, her trembling hands steadying as she loaded the last few rounds she had. Her calico dress was dust-streaked, a tear running across her sleeve from where a stray splinter had grazed her arm. When she looked up at Koda, she saw not just a warrior, but something greater, a man who carried with him centuries of endurance, and now perhaps her fate as well. "They'll come again," she whispered, her voice ragged from smoke and fear. "They won't stop until they have what they came for," Koda finished, his deep voice low but steady. He turned his gaze toward her, and in that moment, the storm in his dark eyes softened. "But this mountain has its own law, and I will not let them take you from it." Elena swallowed hard. She had been taught to fear Apache warriors, had grown up hearing stories that painted them as shadows and dangers. Yet here she was, pressed into survival beside one, and all she could feel was the strength of his present strength that shielded her. When her own hope faltered, the pounding of hooves echoed faintly in the distance again. They weren't gone. They were circling, regrouping. The riders were cunning, and desperate men grew more dangerous when cornered. Helena's pulse quickened. What if they set fire to the cabin? Koda stepped into the open doorway, the cold morning air curling around him. His voice carried the weight of certainty. "Then we meet them in the fire. The mountain will decide who it keeps." His words should have terrified her, but instead they steadied her. She rose to her feet and crossed the room to stand beside him. The closeness of him was overwhelming, his heat, his scent of smoke and cedar, the quiet hum of energy that seemed to roll off his skin. He glanced at her, the beads in his tribal necklace catching the faint light, and for the first time she felt the bond between them shift into something unspoken, yet undeniable. A sharp whistle cut through the trees outside, the signal of the riders. Both froze, instinct driving them into silence. Then the thunder of hooves came again, closer, harder, until it shook the very earth beneath the cabin. Elena gripped her rifle, her knuckles white. Koda raised his bow, the carved wood, smooth in his scarred hands. "They'll break soon," he murmured. "Men like that, they fight for greed, not for soul. Greed burns out." Through the swirling snow, shadows moved, 3 riders bursting from the trees, rifles raised. Koda loosed an arrow, the string snapping with fierce precision. A man cried out, tumbling from his saddle. Elena fired a shot, her aim unflinching now, and another rider staggered before crashing into the snow. The last man veered off, shouting curses that echoed into the forest. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a raven overhead. Elena lowered her rifle, her hands still shaking, but her heart was beating not just with fear, but with fierce exhilaration. She turned to Koda, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would you stay? Why risk yourself for me? You don't even know me." Koda's expression was unreadable for a moment, the firelight flickering across the angles of his face. Then, slowly, he spoke. because when I came to this cabin, I thought I was buying wood and stone. But the mountain gave me something else, a promise." Her breath caught. His words rang with a truth she didn't yet fully understand, but deep down, she felt it too, that something bound them now, forged not just in survival, but in fate. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and unrelenting, as if the mountain itself was closing its arms around them. And for the first time since the riders came, Elena believed they might actually live to see another sunrise. The cabin smelled of smoke and cedar, a faint perfume of battle and survival. Snow still clung to the window ledges, but inside, warmth pulsed from the fire that hissed and crackled as if it too had fought alongside them. The silence after the storm felt heavy, yet alive, like the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would become of its children. Coda sat near the hearth, his shirtless body marked with streaks of blood, soot, and the wild sheen of exertion. His long black hair spilled over his shoulders, tangled and wet from melted snow. Tribal beads and feathers caught the firelight, glinting like tiny sparks of spirit. His chest rose and fell, steady now, though his eyes carried the weight of all that had just transpired. Eliza knelt beside him, hands trembling as she cleaned a shallow cut along his ribs with a strip of cloth torn from her own dress. Her breath was quick, uneven, not just from fear, but from the closeness of him, the gravity of what they had endured together. "You should rest," she whispered, her voice raw. Coda's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "And leave you awake to guard the night alone? No. The mountain is still watching, so am I." Her hands faltered, the cloth pressed too hard against his skin. She met his gaze, her blue-gray eyes catching the firelight just as fiercely as his. "Why did you stay, Coda? You could have left when you first saw trouble coming. Most men would have." He looked into the flames for a long moment before answering, his voice low, resonant, carrying the weight of his ancestors. "My people believe the earth ties spirits together for reasons not always seen. When I first stepped onto this mountain, I felt it an old promise buried in the stones, in the trees, in this cabin. Then I saw you, alone, yet not broken. The mountain told me my place was here." Eliza's throat tightened. She wanted to laugh it off, to push away the strange destiny in his words. But she couldn't. Something deep inside her stirred, something that had been locked away since her father's death and her mother's slow fading. She had waited so long for someone not to save her, but to see her. A gust of wind shook the cabin walls and the fire flared brighter. Eliza leaned back, her hands curling in her lap. "My father built this cabin," she murmured, voice trembling with memory. "He told me before he died that one day someone would come. Not from the town, not from the valley, but someone the mountain itself chose. He said I'd know when they arrived." Coda turned his head slowly, his dark eyes searching her face. "And do you know?" Her breath caught. The storm outside had passed, yet her heart thundered like hooves across open plains. She had fought beside him, trusted him with her life, and seen the fire in his spirit. She knew. She had known the moment she opened the cabin door and found him standing there. "Yes," she whispered, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "It's you." For a moment, time folded in on itself. The fire crackled, the snow fell. The mountain breathed, and in the center of it all, a promise long buried came alive. Coda reached out, his hand rough but steady, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "Then this cabin is no longer lonely," he said softly. "It is ours." Eliza let out a breath that was half sob, half laughter. Her hand slid into his, fingers lacing tightly, as if letting go meant losing everything they had just found. Night deepened, stars scattering across the sky like shards of silver. Outside, the mountain loomed tall and eternal, its silent blessing resting on the small cabin where two souls, one marked by grief, the other by exile, had found their place. And so the mountain kept its promise.